Season 4 of Bridgerton has all the hallmarks of a classic Cinderella story. The stepdaughter forced to work as a maid, sneaking into a ball that she's not really allowed to attend, dancing with a handsome stranger and falling in love with him, then running away at midnight, leaving behind only a small piece of clothing, in this case not a glass slipper but a glove, as a clue to her identity. Then, of course, there's the two stepsisters. One of them, Rosamond, is just as mean and unpleasant as the stepmother, but the other, Posy, is sweet and kind-hearted. Does that also feel a little bit familiar to you? I know that it does to me. There's actually a pretty long tradition of making one of Cinderella's stepsisters the nice one. For example, let's talk about Peony, the younger of the two stepsisters from the Lunar Chronicles, a YA sci-fi fairy tale retelling series. The older stepsister, Pearl, is pretty unpleasant and not a great person, but Peony is just so sweet and innocent, and actually saving her is one of Cinder's main motivations when Peony comes down with the plague. In a very similar way, Anastasia from Season 7 of Once Upon a Time is frozen in a moment with her last breath just barely in her body, just after she almost drowned and without magical intervention would have drowned. The stepmother does some pretty unpleasant things to try to save her, but Anastasia herself isn't innocent, while Drizella is more of a typical wicked stepsister. In the Disney movies, Anastasia is also the nice sister. Not so much in the original one, where there's very little distinction made between the two of them, but certainly in the 2002 sequel, Cinderella 2: Dreams Come True, where she makes up with Cinderella and falls in love with a baker despite her family's objections. This was my personal introduction as a kid to the idea of there being a nice stepsister, but it's certainly not where the idea originated. And I'm not just talking about the 1998 movie Ever After either, although that's another well-known example of it. In fact, it can be traced all the way back to the version published by French fairy tale writer Charles Perrault in 1697. Listen to this. When she had done her work, she used to go to the chimney corner and sit down there in the cinders and ashes, which caused her to be called Cinderwench. Only the younger sister, who was not so rude and uncivil as the older one, called her Cinderella. Perrault was writing in French, and so the original nicknames were different. Cinderella in French is Cendrillon, but that's not really the important part. The important part is, already, even at that point, there was a mean sister and kind of a nicer sister. As far as I can tell, this is where the idea originates, or at least one of the early documented examples of it. Compare with, for example, the Grimm brothers' Cinderella, in which case there's no distinction between the two sisters or stepsisters, and they meet a horrible fate at the end. Whereas in Perrault's version, Cinderella forgives them both, not just the nice one, but the mean one as well. I say that this is one of the early examples of it, but Cinderella is such a commonly told story across many different cultures that it wouldn't surprise me if it's cropped up in other places as well, maybe even earlier. And it certainly is possible that it existed in French oral tradition regarding this story before Charles Perrault wrote it down. Anyway, the point is, Posy from Bridgerton is not the first time that Cinderella has had a nicer stepsister. It's actually part of a long line of this tradition going back at least to the 17th century. I hope that you enjoyed this. If you want to see more from me, be sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.